The spreadsheet landed on the conference table with a soft thud that felt like thunder in my chest. I stared at the numbers, my vision blurring at the edges as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Our joint savings account showed $3,200. The investment portfolio I'd helped build for 15 years was listed as $12,000. Our vacation home in the mountains wasn't listed at all. That can't be right, I whispered, my voice barely carrying across the mediation room. Thomas sat across from me, his posture relaxed, hands folded calmly on the table. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. The slight upturn of his mouth told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a mistake. This was victory, and he was savoring it. The mediator, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, cleared her throat gently. Mrs. Walsh, if you need a moment to review the documents. I need more than a moment, I managed, my hands trembling as I flipped through page after page of what should have been our shared life, now reduced to almost nothing. These numbers don't match our last joint statement. Thomas finally spoke, his voice carrying that tone he used when explaining simple concepts to difficult people. Everything was handled months ago. Megan. We discussed this. We had discussed nothing. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as Thomas leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who had already won. His attorney, a sharp-looking man in an expensive suit, nodded along as Thomas spoke. The restructuring was necessary for tax purposes, Thomas continued, his tone so reasonable it made my skin crawl. I moved assets into separate accounts to protect us both. Standard financial planning. I felt everyone's eyes on me, the mediator, the attorneys, even the assistant taking notes in the corner. They were all watching me process this betrayal in real time, watching me struggle to understand how the man I'd married had quietly dismantled our entire financial life while I slept beside him every night. My throat tightened. I wanted to scream, to throw the spreadsheet back in his face, to demand answers. But I sat frozen, my mind racing through memories I'd dismissed as harmless. The refinance he'd insisted on handling alone. The business accounts he said I didn't need access to. The paperwork he'd brought home for my signature, always presented during dinner or right before bed when I was too tired to read carefully. This wasn't impulsive, I realized aloud, my voice steadier than I expected. You planned this. Thomas's smile widened just slightly. I planned for our future. As my chest tightened and the mediator suggested we take a break, one thought screamed louder than all the others, drowning out the polite voices and shuffling papers around me. My husband transferred our assets before filing for divorce. The words echoed in my mind, each one hitting like a separate blow. Transferred. Assets. Before. Filing. He hadn't just decided to leave. He'd prepared for it, calculated it, moved money and property and investments while still kissing me goodnight and asking about my day. I stood on shaking legs, gathering the documents I'd brought, the ones that showed what our finances were supposed to look like. Thomas remained seated, checking his phone as if this was just another Tuesday meeting. His attorney whispered something that made him chuckle softly. In the hallway, I leaned against the cool wall and closed my eyes. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of trust. And he'd used every bit of it as a weapon against me. But as the shock began to settle, something else rose to take its place. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. More focused. Because there was one thing Thomas had forgotten in all his careful planning. He'd forgotten who I was. My name is Megan Walsh. I'm 41 years old, and I've spent the last 18 years working in compliance and internal auditing at Crawford Regional Finance. I'm not the kind of person who makes emotional decisions or throws accusations without evidence. I'm the person companies call when something doesn't add up. I know what hidden money looks like. I know the patterns, the red flags, the subtle inconsistencies that most people miss. It's my job to find discrepancies, to follow paper trails, to understand when numbers tell a different story than the one being spoken out loud. Thomas knew this about me. We'd met at a networking event when I was 26, and he was launching his first consulting business. He'd been charming then, impressed by my career, my attention to detail. He used to joke that I could spot a fraudulent expense report from across a room. Apparently, he thought marriage would make me blind. I drove home from the mediation in silence, my hand steady on the wheel despite the chaos in my mind. Our house, my house, I corrected myself, sat at the end of a quiet street lined with maple trees. Thomas's car wasn't in the driveway. He'd moved out 3 weeks ago, citing irreconcilable differences. The reconcilable difference, I was learning, was that he wanted everything and I was supposed to accept nothing. I remembered the exact moment I should have known. It was 18 months ago, maybe longer. Thomas had come home excited about a refinance opportunity, saying interest rates were perfect and we could save thousands. "Let me handle the paperwork," he'd said, kissing the top of my head as I worked on a compliance report at the kitchen table. "You're busy, and I know you trust me." I did trust him. That was my mistake. The paperwork appeared in stages, always one document at a time, always presented when I was distracted or tired. "Just need your signature here," he'd say, pointing to highlighted lines. I'd signed. Of course I'd signed. He was my husband. There were other moments too, now crystallizing in my memory with painful clarity. The business account he'd opened for tax purposes that I wasn't added to. The investment advisor he'd started seeing without me, saying I was too busy to attend meetings. The vacation property deed that needed updating because of some technical requirement I didn't understand. Each time, I'd had a flicker of doubt. A small voice asking why I wasn't more involved. But I'd pushed it down, labeled myself paranoid, reminded myself that marriage meant trust. Trust is the cheapest weapon. It requires no money, no planning, just patience. And Thomas had been very patient. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by file folders I'd kept in my home office. Bank statements, investment reports, property documents. I organized them chronologically, letting my training take over, approaching this like any other audit. The inconsistencies jumped out immediately now that I was looking for them. A transfer of $45,000 from our joint investment account in March, labeled portfolio rebalancing. Another $30,000 moved in July, noted as tax strategy adjustment. Smaller amounts throughout the year, each with a legitimate-sounding explanation. The vacation property showed a deed transfer in September. I pulled out the document I'd signed, reading it carefully this time. The language was dense, full of legal terms, but the meaning was clear. I'd signed over my interest in the property to Thomas's business LLC. Why would I do that? I tried to remember the explanation he'd given. Something about liability protection. Asset security. He'd made it sound like he was protecting us both. I made notes in my compliance notebook, the same kind I used at work. Dates. Amounts. Document references. Not because I knew what I'd do with the information, but because documentation was instinct. The first red flag I'd actually questioned out loud had been the business account. Why can't I see the statements? I'd asked. It's just business expenses, Thomas had replied. Nothing that affects our personal finances. I hadn't fought, but I had taken notes. The second mediation session was scheduled for the following week. I spent the intervening days doing exactly what Thomas expected, staying quiet, processing the shock, accepting my new reality. At least, that's what he thought I was doing. In truth, I was organizing. Not for battle, not yet, but for understanding. I made copies of everything. I created spreadsheets comparing what I knew to be true with what Thomas had presented in mediation. The gaps were significant. When we returned to the conference room, I brought a single folder. Nothing dramatic. No accusations. I sat down, arranged my papers neatly, and waited. Thomas walked in with the same confident stride, the same half-smile. His attorney carried 3 briefcases. They were prepared for war. I nodded politely at the mediator. "Thank you for seeing us again." Thomas relaxed visibly. He'd expected tears, arguments, desperate pleas. Instead, I was composed, professional, accepting. He thought I'd surrendered. That was his second mistake. His first was underestimating how much I understood about money, about documentation, about the small trails people leave when they think they're being clever. I could see it in his eyes. Relief. He'd won. The hard part was over. Now we'd just formalize the inevitable. I almost felt sorry for him. 2 days later, a routine audit request landed on my desk at Crawford Regional Finance. I opened the file without thinking, my mind still half-focused on the divorce proceedings. Then I saw the company name, Walsh Business Solutions, LLC. My stomach dropped. Thomas's consulting company was listed as a vendor for one of our clients. The audit was standard procedure, checking compliance, verifying contract terms, ensuring proper documentation. Nothing unusual. Except that his company's financial records would be reviewed. Except that asset transfers would be examined. Except that I was the auditor assigned to the case. I sat frozen at my desk, staring at the file. This wasn't planned. It was coincidence, the kind of random occurrence that happens in a small business community where everyone eventually crosses paths professionally. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the phone and called my supervisor. "Nathan, I need to report a conflict of interest," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "The Walsh LLC audit, that's my husband's company. Well, soon-to-be ex-husband." There was a pause. "I appreciate you flagging that immediately. I'll reassign it." "Thank you." I hung up and stared at the file. This had just become professional. And that changed everything. The audit was reassigned to Jordan Chen. I stopped myself. Jordan Bradley, a colleague I respected, someone thorough and by the book. I disclosed everything properly, filed the conflict of interest paperwork, and stayed completely within company policy. But policy didn't prevent me from knowing the audit was happening. It didn't prevent me from understanding what would be reviewed. And it certainly didn't prevent me from recognizing what red flags might emerge when someone looked at Thomas's business finances properly. I went about my normal work, focusing on other clients, maintaining my professional reputation. Crawford Regional Finance had strict ethical standards, and I'd never once compromised them. I wasn't about to start now, but I was allowed to observe general outcomes. I was allowed to know when audits escalated, and I was allowed to understand what certain findings meant. Jordan stopped by my office 3 days into the review. "The Walsh audit is getting interesting," he mentioned casually. "Some timeline inconsistencies in asset transfers. Probably nothing, but I'm going to need to dig deeper." "That's your call," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Follow your standard process." He nodded and left. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding. I hadn't pushed. I hadn't influenced. I'd simply reported a conflict and stepped aside. But the audit would continue. Professional, thorough, unbiased. And whatever it found would be documented officially. The timeline problems Jordan mentioned weren't complicated. Asset transfers from personal accounts to Thomas's business LLC had occurred on specific dates that overlapped with our marriage. Dates when those assets were still legally marital property. Transferring marital assets without spousal consent during a marriage isn't just unethical. In our state, it's potentially fraudulent. I knew this because it was basic financial law. Thomas should have known it too. But somewhere in his careful planning, he'd gotten sloppy. Maybe he'd moved too fast. Maybe he'd been too confident that I wouldn't question anything. Or maybe he'd simply assumed that our personal relationship would keep me from ever seeing his business records professionally. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Thomas, Hope you're doing okay. This doesn't have to get ugly. I stared at the message, anger finally breaking through my careful composure. He was offering olive branches while his financial crimes were being uncovered by auditors who didn't care about marriage vows or hurt feelings. It already is ugly, I thought. You just don't know it yet. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and reviewed my own documents again. The more I looked, the more I saw. Jordan's audit revealed what I'd suspected. Shell companies, undervalued transfers, backdated documents. Thomas had created a network of LLCs, each one holding pieces of our marital assets. On paper, they looked legitimate. But the dates told a different story. One company was formed 6 months before Thomas filed for divorce. Within 2 weeks, our vacation property had been transferred to it for a fraction of its market value. Another LLC received investment accounts worth $80,000, recorded as a business investment despite having no actual business purpose. The signatures on the transfer documents were mine. I'd signed them, believing Thomas's explanations about asset protection and tax benefits. But the timing revealed the truth. He'd been planning his exit long before he'd ever mentioned being unhappy. Crawford Regional Finance's audit escalated automatically when irregularities were flagged. It wasn't Jordan's decision. It wasn't mine. It was protocol, the same protocol that protected clients from fraud every day. Thomas received notice that his business contracts were under review pending compliance verification. I only knew because Jordan mentioned it in passing during a staff meeting, discussing general audit procedures. Sometimes people get creative with asset classifications, he said. That's when things get complicated. Our eyes met briefly. He knew I understood exactly what he meant. The third mediation session had a different atmosphere. Thomas's attorney had requested a delay, but the mediator insisted we proceed with preliminary discussions. When Thomas walked in, his confidence had developed cracks. He sat down across from me, and for the first time since this started, he really looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. The mediator opened her folder. Mr. Walsh, we've received some questions regarding the asset valuations you provided. Specifically, there are concerns about transfer dates and ownership documentation. Thomas's jaw tightened. What concerns? Your business accounts show several large transfers from joint marital accounts during the past 18 months. Can you explain the purpose and timing of these transfers? I watched him process the question, saw the moment he realized that someone had been looking at his business finances. Someone thorough. Someone who understood what they were seeing. His eyes snapped to mine. Did you? I disclosed a conflict of interest. I interrupted calmly. Your company came up in a routine client audit. I removed myself from the case immediately. It was the truth. Every word was the truth. But the audit had continued without me. And audits don't care about personal relationships. They only care about facts. Thomas's attorney leaned forward. These are business matters, separate from the marriage. The mediator adjusted her glasses. Actually, the transfers occurred while the marriage was intact, involving assets that appear to be marital property. That raises questions about proper disclosure and division. I can explain every transaction, Thomas said, but his voice had lost its steadiness. He was over-explaining now, talking too fast, contradicting himself about dates and purposes. Arrogance always talks too much. I'd learned that in compliance training. When someone's hiding something, they can't help but over-justify, adding details that don't match, creating stories that become more complicated with each telling. The mediator took notes. I think we need to pause this discussion pending additional documentation. Mr. Walsh, you'll need to provide complete financial records for all business entities formed during the marriage, including transfer documentation and valuation reports. Thomas's face flushed. That's my private business. Assets transferred from marital accounts make them relevant to the divorce proceedings. she replied firmly. If you'd like to continue mediation, full financial disclosure is required. Otherwise, we'll need to move this to court discovery. The room fell silent. Thomas looked at his attorney, who was already typing notes on his laptop. We'll provide the documentation, the attorney finally said. But we all knew what that meant. Discovery was coming. The judge ordered a forensic review 3 weeks later. Thomas had tried to avoid it, offering increasingly generous settlement proposals, but his own statements in mediation had raised too many questions. A forensic accountant would review every business transaction, every transfer, every document. They'd verify dates, trace money trails, and determine whether marital assets had been improperly hidden or transferred. I didn't request the forensic review. The mediator did, based on the inconsistencies in Thomas's own documentation. But I wasn't surprised when it happened. At work, Jordan stopped by with an update. The Walsh audit wrapped up. Several compliance violations, some timing issues with asset classifications. The client terminated their contract. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Did everything follow protocol? Completely. All by the book. He paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry you're going through this. Thank you. After he left, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Thomas had lost a major client, not because of me, but because of his own failure to maintain proper business practices. The audit had simply revealed what was already there. Sometimes the truth doesn't need a push. It just needs someone willing to look. The forensic accountant's preliminary report arrived in my attorney's office on a Tuesday morning. She called me immediately. Megan, you need to see this. I drove to her office, my hand steady on the wheel. Whatever the report said, I was ready for it. The accountant had found everything. Every transfer, every backdated document, every shell company Thomas had created. But he'd also found something else, something Thomas himself had apparently forgotten about. A trust fund. Created 8 years ago when Thomas's father died, leaving him a substantial inheritance. Thomas had placed the money in a trust, naming himself as the primary beneficiary but listing both of us as co-trustees. Then he'd apparently forgotten it existed. The trust held $340,000. It had grown steadily over the years, managed by an investment firm Thomas never mentioned. He'd hidden it so thoroughly, buried under so many layers of business accounts and shell companies, that he'd lost track of it himself. This is marital property, my attorney said, sliding the report across her desk. He can't claim it's a business asset or a premarital account. And because you're listed as co-trustee, he couldn't transfer it without your signature. I stared at the numbers, finally understanding the full scope of Thomas's deception. He hadn't just moved our obvious assets. He'd been hiding money for years, layers upon layers of financial manipulation. But he'd gotten so clever, so elaborate, that he'd outsmarted himself. The fourth mediation session was brief. Thomas walked in looking defeated, his attorney carrying significantly fewer briefcases this time. The mediator laid out the forensic findings. Assets would be reclassified. Transfers made without proper disclosure would be reversed. Penalties would be applied for financial misconduct during divorce proceedings. Thomas stared at the table, his confidence completely shattered. He glanced at me once, and I saw something I'd never expected to see in his eyes. Genuine surprise. He truly thought I wouldn't fight back. Truly believed I'd accept his version of events, sign whatever papers he provided, and walk away quietly. I'd like to discuss a revised settlement, his attorney said. For the first time in months, I spoke directly to Thomas. Now you want to be reasonable. He didn't answer. The mediator outlined the new reality. Based on the forensic findings, our assets would be divided equitably, including the trust fund Thomas had tried to hide. Penalties for improper transfers would be deducted from his share. And because he'd violated disclosure requirements, I'd be entitled to reimbursement for my legal fees and the forensic accounting costs. These terms are non-negotiable, the mediator added. If you refuse, we proceed to court, where the findings will become public record. Thomas's business reputation would be destroyed if this went to trial. He knew it. His attorney knew it. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The settlement was finalized 6 weeks later. I received half of our legitimate marital assets, plus the full trust fund amount since Thomas had attempted to conceal it. After penalties and fee reimbursements, I walked away with 70% of everything we'd built together. Thomas got his business, what was left of it after losing major clients, his car, and his new apartment. He also got a reputation as someone who couldn't be trusted with financial matters, which in our small business community was essentially a career death sentence. I didn't gloat. I didn't argue. I simply let the process finish. Let the truth speak for itself. Because that's what Thomas never understood. He thought I'd be emotional, irrational, easy to manipulate. He thought his careful planning would overcome any resistance I might offer. But I'd never been the kind of person who needed to fight dirty. I just needed to be patient, to stay professional, to let the systems I trusted do their job. Justice doesn't need volume. It just needs time and truth. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected call from Nathan, my supervisor at Crawford Regional Finance. Megan, I wanted to let you know that the Ethics Committee reviewed your handling of the Walsh conflict of interest. You followed protocol perfectly, immediate disclosure, complete recusal, no influence on the audit process. Thank you, I said, relief washing over me. I'd been confident in my actions, but official confirmation mattered. In fact, he continued, your professionalism during a difficult personal situation has been noted positively. There's a senior auditor position opening up. I'd like to recommend you for it. After we hung up, I sat at my desk and allowed myself a moment of real pride. Not because of the divorce settlement, not because Thomas had lost everything, but because I'd maintained my integrity throughout. I'd played by the rules, followed the ethics, stayed true to who I was even when it would have been easy to bend those principles. That mattered more than any financial victory. I moved out of the house Thomas and I had shared, finding a smaller place closer to downtown. It had good light, hardwood floors, and no memories attached to it. The first night in my new apartment, I sat on the floor surrounded by unpacked boxes and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness yet. That would come later. But peace. The calm that comes from knowing you handled a crisis with grace, from discovering you're stronger than you thought, from realizing that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Congratulations on the new place. I heard you got promoted too. You won. I recognized Thomas's writing style, his need to have the last word even in defeat. I typed back, this was never about winning. Then I blocked the number. Because it wasn't about winning. It was about surviving with my dignity intact, about proving that patience and principle could triumph over manipulation and greed. Thomas had tried to destroy me financially, thinking money was the only thing that mattered. He'd forgotten that some things can't be stolen or transferred or hidden in shell companies. Self-respect. Professional integrity. The quiet strength of knowing you did everything right. Those were mine, and they always had been. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new office. The promotion had come through, when Jordan stopped by with coffee. Thought you could use this, he said, setting the cup on my desk. Big client presentation today. Just the quarterly compliance review. Nothing dramatic. He smiled. You know, people around here talk about how you handled your divorce. The way you stayed professional, followed the rules even when it would have been easier not to. I felt uncomfortable with the attention. I just did my job. That's exactly why it matters, he replied. In a situation designed to make people emotional and reckless, you stayed rational. That takes serious strength. After he left, I thought about those words. Strength. I'd never thought of myself as particularly strong. Competent. Yes. Detail-oriented. Absolutely. But strong. Maybe strength wasn't about fighting loudest or hardest. Maybe it was about staying steady when everything around you was chaos. About trusting that truth would prevail if you gave it time and space. Thomas had taught me that lesson, though not in the way he'd intended. His betrayal had shown me what I was capable of when I stopped doubting myself, stopped accepting less than I deserved, stopped confusing patience with passivity. I'd been strong all along. I just hadn't known it. A year after the divorce, I ran into Thomas's sister, Angela, at a coffee shop. We'd always gotten along well, and I wasn't sure how to navigate the awkwardness. "Megan," she said, approaching my table hesitantly. "I've wanted to reach out, but I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me." "It's fine," I assured her. "Sit down." We talked for nearly an hour. She told me Thomas had moved to another state, taking a job with a smaller firm. His reputation in our community never recovered, and starting over elsewhere had seemed like his only option. "He's bitter," Angela admitted. "He blames you for everything. The audit, the forensic review, the settlement. He thinks you orchestrated it all." "I didn't have to," I replied simply. "He did it to himself." She nodded. "No. But Thomas will never see it that way. He'll always believe he was the victim." We parted on friendly terms, but her words stayed with me. Thomas would never understand what had really happened. He'd never accept that his own arrogance and greed had been his downfall. And that was okay. I didn't need his understanding or acceptance. I didn't need him to acknowledge what he'd done or apologize for his betrayal. I just needed to keep moving forward. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Thomas's attorney, requesting a brief phone conversation. I almost declined, but curiosity won out. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm sorry, Ms. Walsh now. I'm calling because Mr. Walsh has asked me to reach out regarding a matter of closure." I waited, saying nothing. He wanted me to convey that he understands why you're angry, and he hopes eventually you'll be able to forgive him for the misunderstandings that occurred during the divorce proceedings. Misunderstandings. As if fraud and deception were simple miscommunications. "I appreciate the call," I said carefully, "but there's nothing to forgive. Thomas made choices, and those choices had consequences. That's not anger, it's just reality." After hanging up, I realized the truth in my own words. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires energy, emotional investment, a belief that the other person still matters enough to hate. I felt none of that. Thomas had become irrelevant to my life, a chapter that had closed completely. That was the real ending, I thought. Not the settlement or the finalized papers, but the moment when someone who'd once meant everything became simply someone I used to know. 2 years after walking out of that first mediation session, I was living a life I'd never imagined. The senior auditor position had led to more opportunities. I'd started teaching compliance workshops on weekends, sharing what I'd learned about protecting yourself financially, about understanding your worth, about staying professional even when personal relationships tried to destroy you. Women came to my workshops specifically because of my story, the quiet accountant who'd outmaneuvered her manipulative husband without ever raising her voice or breaking a single rule. "How did you stay so calm?" one woman asked after a workshop. Her husband had recently filed for divorce, and she was terrified of losing everything. "I stayed focused on what I could control," I told her. "I couldn't control his choices or his deception, but I could control my response. I could document everything, follow proper procedures, and trust that the truth would matter." But what if it hadn't worked? What if the audit hadn't happened? I thought about that. Then I would have found another way. Because I knew what was true, and truth always finds a way to surface. You just have to be patient enough to let it. She left looking more hopeful, and I felt that familiar sense of purpose.